It started like any other afternoon. My daughter Emily was outside enjoying the fresh air, walking along the sidewalk near our house, humming softly to herself, like she always does when she's feeling calm. Emily is autistic, and her daily walks help her regulate her emotions. She wasn't bothering anyone, wasn't doing anything wrong. But apparently, that wasn't good enough for our HOA. Out of nowhere, a neighbor, someone I barely even recognized, stormed over, demanding to know why Emily was wandering around. I calmly explained that she wasn't wandering, she was just taking her usual walk. But instead of listening, this person gave me a cold look and muttered something about suspicious behavior. Before I knew it, they were on the phone with the police. Minutes later, squad cars pulled up in front of my house. Officers stepped out, scanning the scene like some major crime was happening. My heart pounded, but I kept my cool. I knew exactly how this would go, because what they didn't know was that I'm a US Marshal. The moment I pulled out my credentials, everything changed. The neighbor's face went pale. The officers exchanged nervous glances, and just like that, the people who thought they had power over us suddenly realized they had made a big mistake. But that was only the beginning. The officers hesitated, their confident demeanor shifting the second they saw my badge. One of them, a younger guy, cleared his throat and stepped forward. Sir, we got a call about a suspicious individual," he said, his voice suddenly unsure. I took a deep breath, glancing over at Emily, who was now clutching the hem of her shirt, her body rocking slightly, her way of coping with stress. I turned back to the officers. "You mean my daughter?" I asked, keeping my tone steady but firm. "The one who was just walking near her own home." The older officer sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He knew this was a mistake. The neighbor, though, she still didn't get it. She crossed her arms, her expression tight with frustration. "Well, how was I supposed to know?" she snapped. She was acting strange. That did it. I felt my jaw tighten. "Strange," I repeated. "She's autistic. She wasn't doing anything but existing in a way that makes sense to her." The officers shifted uncomfortably. They weren't sure what to do now. They had been called out expecting a problem, but the only problem was the person who called them in the first place. And as I watched my neighbor's face, I could tell she was starting to realize she had made a big mistake, but she wasn't done yet. As the tension hung in the air, I could feel the weight of the situation shifting. The officers were stuck in an awkward silence, unsure of how to proceed. Emily, still clutching her shirt, took a small step backward, her eyes darting between me and the officers. I knew that look. It was the kind of anxiety that came from feeling misunderstood. I stepped closer to her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder, trying to reassure her. But the neighbor wasn't backing down. "I'm just saying," she continued, her voice rising a little. "I've seen her walking around here for weeks, and it's always a bit unsettling. She doesn't act normal like the other kids." Someone had to say something. I could feel my blood boiling at her words. The sheer audacity of it. The idea that she thought Emily didn't belong in this neighborhood just because she was different. I took a deep breath, trying to stay composed. "You don't know her. You don't understand autism, or what it's like for someone to process the world differently." The younger officer, still holding his notepad, seemed to pick up on the shift in the conversation. "Ma'am, perhaps," he started, but she cut him off, her voice sharp. "I just don't think it's safe. What if something happens and we don't know how to handle it?" I could tell she was spiraling into panic now, but I wasn't about to let her twist the narrative. "Safe?" I asked, my voice steady. "What's unsafe about a child walking on her own property? You're the one who made this unsafe by calling the police in the first place." The older officer finally stepped in, his eyes narrowing at the neighbor. He wasn't angry, but there was a level of disappointment in his gaze that made her pause. He turned to me, his expression softening a little. "We're sorry for the inconvenience, sir, but there's really nothing for us to do here. If you'd like to file a report or take further action." I wasn't interested in filing reports. What I wanted was to make sure Emily was left alone, to ensure no one would try to paint her as something she wasn't. But as the conversation continued, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about a misunderstanding. There was something deeper at play here, something that the neighbor wasn't saying, and I was starting to feel the pressure of a bigger conflict brewing. Then, just as the officers started to walk away, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my partner. 3 words, asterisk, they're watching us. Asterisk, the mystery was thickening. I stared at the text message for a long moment, my mind racing. They're watching us. It felt like the ground beneath my feet had shifted. I looked up, my eyes scanning the faces around me. The officers, the neighbor, even Emily, who had become quiet, her anxiety evident in the way she fidgeted with her fingers. I had no idea who they were, but the message had come through loud and clear. This wasn't just about an upset neighbor anymore. Someone was keeping an eye on us, and I had a feeling it wasn't because of some trivial HOA complaint. The older officer gave a final nod and walked back toward his car, the younger one lingering behind, still uncertain. I turned to him, trying to keep my voice calm, even though the adrenaline was pumping through my veins. I'll need to know who called this in. I want to know exactly who's causing trouble in my neighborhood. He hesitated for a moment before responding. I'm afraid we can't give out that information, but, if you have concerns. I have more than concerns. I cut him off, my words sharper now. I could feel a shift inside me, the feeling that something much bigger was at play here, and it was no longer just about protecting my daughter. This was about protecting everything I had worked for. Behind me, I heard the neighbor mutter something under her breath, something about how people like me shouldn't be allowed to live in a community. I didn't even turn to face her. I could feel the venom in her words without looking. But just as I was about to respond, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. A car had pulled up slowly down the street, turning in at the end of our cul-de-sac. The tinted windows didn't give away anything, but the way it idled, slowly, deliberately, sent a chill down my spine. I turned back to the officers, my heart pounding now. "Do you see that car?" I asked, my voice low. The younger officer glanced over, his brow furrowing. "Yeah, what about it?" "I don't know yet, but it's not good." I could feel the urgency building, my instincts telling me something was about to snap. I glanced at Emily, who was still holding onto my hand, her eyes wide, confused by the tension around her. She didn't understand what was happening, but I did. And whatever this was, it was escalating fast. The car didn't move. It just sat there, as if waiting for something or someone. My thoughts raced as I tried to piece things together. I had no idea who was behind this, or why they were targeting us. But I did know one thing: we weren't going to be left alone. And before I could act, the car's door swung open. A figure stepped out, and my heart dropped. They weren't here for the HOA complaint. They were here for something much worse. The figure who stepped out of the car wasn't who I expected. It wasn't some local troublemaker or an aggressive HOA enforcer. It was someone I recognized. A man in a dark suit, his face expressionless. He didn't look like someone who belonged in our quiet neighborhood. He looked like someone who belonged in a much darker world. My heart skipped a beat as I realized who it was. I knew him from a past life, a life I had tried to leave behind the day I became a U.S. Marshal. Victor Callahan. He was a name I hadn't thought about in years. A name that brought back memories I'd rather forget. I had helped put him behind bars. He had been one of the most notorious criminals I'd ever worked with, part of a criminal syndicate that ran operations all across the country. But I thought he was finished. I thought his time had come and gone. Apparently, I was wrong. Victor didn't even glance at the officers. His cold eyes locked onto me, and I could see a smirk pulling at the corner of his lips. He walked toward me, slow and deliberate, every step echoing in the tense silence. The younger officer took a few cautious steps back, sensing the shift in the air, but I stood my ground. "Marshal," Victor said, his voice smooth and dangerous. "You look exactly the same as I remember." The weight of his words sank in as I realized this was no coincidence. This wasn't some random encounter. He was here for me, for something I had done, or something I had left behind. My past had come crashing into my present, and it wasn't here to play nice. Behind me, I heard a faint rustling. I turned just in time to see Emily's eyes widen in confusion, her body trembling with fear. She didn't know who he was, but she felt the danger, the shift in the atmosphere. I couldn't let this get to her, but the moment Victor spoke again, I knew he wasn't just here for me. He was here for all of us. "You really thought you could escape your past, didn't you?" he said, his eyes gleaming with a dark satisfaction. "Well, let's see how long you can keep running." I felt my pulse race. This wasn't just about a misinterpreted HOA call anymore. This was bigger, much bigger. Victor's smirk deepened as he took another step toward me, but this time I didn't flinch. I couldn't. Emily was still behind me, and I had to protect her, no matter what. The officers were frozen, unsure of what was happening, their hands hovering near their holsters. This wasn't the kind of situation they were trained to handle, but I was. "Stay back," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "This doesn't involve you." Victor tilted his head, his eyes never leaving mine. "You always were a hard one to break," he muttered, almost to himself. But then he looked over my shoulder, his gaze landing on Emily. "I see you've made a nice little life here, Marshal. Too bad it's about to come to an end." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew this wasn't a random visit anymore. He wasn't just here to intimidate me. He was here to make sure I couldn't walk away from my past. His eyes gleamed with malicious intent, and I could see the twisted satisfaction building behind them. But I wasn't about to let him win. Before I could respond, the sound of another car pulling up interrupted the moment. The officers turned toward it, their hands moving instinctively to their weapons. Victor didn't seem worried. I knew why. He had backup, and it wasn't just any backup. The car door opened, and out stepped another figure. This time, someone I hadn't seen in years, but someone I had never fully trusted. Daniel Hayes, my former partner. The one who had walked away from the force under questionable circumstances. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be part of this life. "Looks like you've been busy, old friend," Daniel said, his tone casual but with a razor-sharp edge. He walked up to Victor's side, and suddenly it all clicked. The reason Victor had come here wasn't just to settle old scores with me. It was to finish something bigger than that. Daniel had been feeding information to Victor this whole time, keeping tabs on me, watching me from the shadows. Everything I thought I knew about my past, every reason I had left that life behind, had been a lie. Daniel hadn't walked away from the force, he'd been working for the enemy all along. He had been part of the operation that had brought Victor's syndicate crashing down, but it wasn't for justice. It was for something far more personal. Victor's smirk faltered as he turned toward Daniel. "You told me he wouldn't be a problem. You said he was finished."